And we're going to start with public defender and Mary.
Thank you. You might be asking, why is a public defender introducing Linus? And I actually think it's perfect because the relationship between criminal law and immigration has become more intertwined than ever, and it's extremely critical that we have good partnerships in criminal defense with the immigration bar because it affects so many of our clients. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for asking me to introduce Linus, who I'm a big fan of. Well, even though he poached our immigration lawyer,
I did not. Well,
Does she not work in your clinic?
Yes, she does.
Okay.
I use no bribery whatsoever.
Not at all.
Just some coaching.
Just some poaching. So Linus did immigration detention law, among other things, for 10 years before he came to the University of Minnesota Law School at the what's now called the Binger, or the James Binger Center for New Americans, in 2013. He's been a terrific partner with us. As public defenders, we do screen people when they come in on immigration cases, but we cannot defend them in immigration court. And that is what Linus does. So Linus is a fountain of information about what actually happens to people when they go into detention and they have to make appearances in immigration court. And he's been a great partner we have referred clients at times that his clinic has helped. Linus is a terrific guy. In March of 2017, he won the University of Minnesota's Outstanding Community Service Award. And in December of 2017, he was named a Minnesota Lawyer Attorney of the Year. So please help me welcome Linus Chase.
Introductions are always sort of weird. It's a little like reading your own epitaph on a grave, right? Hearing people talk at your funeral or something. Thank you, Mary, and obviously it's a mutual fan club. It's really wonderful to work with the Hennepin County Public Defenders. I don't think it's a secret at all, but the Hennepin County Public Defender's Office is absolutely one of the great resources in the entire state, if not the country, and they do really wonderful work on criminal defense. So, how many of you were here last year? Because I gave a version of this presentation last year. No, so I'm not going to re-bore everyone? Okay. I was about to say that last year was sort of a weird time to do these presentations. The Trump administration had just started, and there were a number of memos, and there was a lot of fear. And so there was a lot of feeling as if the sky is falling. So where are we now, a year after that? I can tell you that I think in many ways the sky is falling. The child separation crisis at the border is just one example of what's happening in ICE detention. But for my work and my work here in Minnesota, you can also see subtle but significant changes in immigration enforcement that's going on. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be here to talk about. Now, I understand that many of you guys in county government also have concerns about how immigration enforcement can impact your work, and I will do my best to answer some questions. For instance, I'm sure some of you have heard about proposed changes to the administration's view of what considers a public charge, right? For those of you who work with public benefits, that can have a very serious impact on your clients and what's going on, because those changes, they are currently proposed, but if they ever become policy and law, will, I think, have an extreme effect. Things like the new 2020 census and questions about citizenship. Quite a few people who work in the area of census work are extremely concerned about what that might mean. And of course, the census, affects everyone. It affects all forms of government, all forms of benefits there. So there are different things specifically that I could talk about, a little bit about Hennepin County government, but I am not an expert on government. So if there's something that you need to educate me on something, please don't be shy on doing that. Okay. So immigration enforcement. I made this wonderful presentation just yesterday. No, I made it a while ago. And the idea here is I'm not gonna bore you by going through slide by slide and talking about everything. What I do want to do though is show a little bit about what this is the overall kind of 10,000 feet in the air sort of view of immigration enforcement and its importance here. So there's two ways that I've sort of split it up. I think we're talking about. So one way is process individually. What's happening on the ground? What has been changes to the practice of immigration enforcement? Okay. Things like how long things take, where are people going, who is doing the enforcing. Some of those controversies, and we can talk a little bit about that as we get there. The second thing that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the law. What's the actual law on the books? Now, the second part is interesting because in many ways, as you guys know, Congress hasn't passed anything in this area. But because immigration is administrative law, it doesn't necessarily require congressional action to have a very serious effect on immigration enforcement. Okay? So let's start out with general basics here. How does someone end up in the immigration enforcement world? What happens? What starts them out? And when are they going to be in trouble? Who? Right? So, what do you guys think? What's one of the top ways that someone can end up finding themselves in the removal process? Being a non-citizen, right? That's hopefully most of the people who are in the process are non-immigrants. What we know and what data has shown is quite a few citizens are caught up in this too, right? Why do you guys think that is? Why do you think citizens end up in the immigration side? Now, the law is clear. A U.S. citizen is immune from this whole process, right?
There's been several articles in the paper recently about children who were born in the border areas of Texas, but who lived by midwives in the home.
Yeah.
And because they may have a Spanish surname, there's a question as to whether or not these birth certificates filled out by the midwives are actually legal and whether or not they are false.
Yeah. So one thing, and I think it's something that is underappreciated, is how many of us, if you are a citizen, how many of us, if someone stopped me today, can prove that I'm a citizen? What do I have in my wallet? I have a driver's license. Maybe I have a social security card, but I don't. I don't personally carry my social security card around with me. I don't carry my passport with me, right? So if someone to actually physically say, prove to me you're a U.S. citizen, what am I going to do? Hand the phone over, say, call my mom? She was at my birth, and I happened to be in North Carolina at the time. So the nature of citizenship is a sort of a weird thing when it comes to it. We do not have a national ID. There is a debate about whether we should or we shouldn't have it, but at least traditionally, if you look at historically, there's been a lot of pressure against having this idea of a document that we are all obligated to carry with ourselves to prove that we are a U.S. citizen. So yes, one is the weird nature of citizenship in the first place. Yes. Now that's there is definitely now a whole unit being created with the sole purpose of looking at people who were naturalized and whether or not they can be denaturalized. So as a natural born citizen, meaning I was born in the United States, no matter what, I cannot be denaturalized against my will. The Supreme Court has actually said something to the effect that this would be cruel and unusual, and it would be not allowed. The 14th Amendment is the one that protects birthright citizenship. There's a little debate about exactly the contours of it, but the majority view here is, since I'm born in the United States, no one can take that citizenship away from me unless I want to avoid taxes and decide that I don't want to pay my taxes and no longer be a citizen, right? But naturalized citizens are different. Why? Because there's a whole process in which a naturalized citizen can become denaturalized. One of the most common one that happened before this administration were former Nazis. Former Nazis who had naturalized were continually being investigated at some point, right? There was always, what would happen is some information from Europe would be passed on to the United States saying, hey, we have some records that this person was a guard at a famous Nazi internment camp. You might want to check it out. Then the investigation would happen and they go, oh, this person obtained naturalization by lying, by not including information that they were a Nazi because we were not allowing Nazis to naturalize or become lawful permanent residents for that matter. So those for a long, long time were the only cases of denaturalization. Then there became more cases of denaturalization if they had committed a crime that would have made them ineligible for naturalization, but they ended up getting naturalized anyway, either by a mistake or even if because the crime had not been final, right? The conviction wasn't final at the time of the naturalization. So then those cases happen. The worry and the fear about this new form of denaturalization is how much are they going to look at what might be common mistakes, really simple mistakes about what happened in naturalization. How does this affect people here in Minnesota? Well, this could potentially have an enormous effect on people in Minnesota. Why? Because we have a large refugee population, right? Refugee populations came to the United States, many of them without really great documentation. And many of them using family relationships to come into the United States that were perhaps culturally acceptable and culturally understood, but may not have necessarily been clear about exactly who is whose father or uncle, right? I mean, I think I've had many a client who, when they came to the United States, they came with their uncle or their aunt. Most of them legally, right? They disclosed it, it was fine. But that may not be the case for everybody. And the question for this denaturalization project that this administration is deciding to take is, how much are they actually digging in? Are they going to be looking at those records and affecting those people? And I think it is going to have a disproportionate effect on refugees, specifically because the manner in which refugees arrived in the United States and came to the United States, it's not that they were nefarious, but a lot of documentation was missing and a lot of cultural understandings about what's happening. For instance, right, I'm sure you all know, Somalis, when their birth certificate, so many Somalis happened to be born on New Year's Day. Right? That can't be right? A huge number of births on New Year's. Can you imagine the midwives? My wife is a midwife. So can you imagine what would happen on New Year's Day? It's like, but obviously what was happening is the documentation was missing, and that's what they were ending up declaring. Do I think that issue is going to be one that causes denaturalization? No. But there is potential problems here with that. Another reason why citizenship can be problematic and why citizens end up in immigration detention is because the laws around citizenship can be confusing. For example, John McCain was not born in the United States, but he's a citizen. Why? Some people think it's because he was born in the Panama Canal Zone. Except there are a lot of people born in Panama, right? Well, it's because it's two things. One, he was born to U.S. citizen parents. So even though he was not born in the United States, he was born to parents who are U.S. citizens. And the second is he happened to be born on a military base. But there are other situations. So just because I'm not born in the United States doesn't mean I'm not a U.S. citizen. But there are lots of questions about that. For instance, how long did my parents live in the United States before I was born? Were my parents married? Was my mother a U.S. citizen or my father a U.S. citizen? That's just one example of how complicated that law is, and it changed throughout the years. Was I born earlier than 1956? Was I born earlier than 1980s? All of that, different laws apply. Similarly, you could be a U.S. citizen if you were not born in the United States and not born to U.S. citizen parents, but your parents became U.S. citizens while you were in the United States, living with them under what's called lawful, physical, and legal custody, and they happen to be a U.S. citizen. Okay? So the law is complicated on citizens, which is why, even though citizens are immune from this removal process, you will find citizens on a regular basis facing removal. I just had one 2 weeks ago, and the question there was whether or not the marriage was properly recognized at a certain point in time, whether they were adopted before the age of 16, etc., etc. Okay, but who are being apprehended? Well, they're normally non-citizens. How are they being apprehended? Many of them are still through the criminal justice system. Now, what's changed? One of the biggest changes about this apprehension process, and I'm talking about for the ones in the criminal justice system, is that previously people were being picked up in the criminal justice system a little bit later in the process, meaning that often they were being picked up after at least they had a public defender assigned to their case, or they had at least one hearing in front of the court, or they were actually convicted of a crime. Okay? And it's going to be very important how this affects different groups of people. All right, so this, bear with me for a second. Let me see if I can find the example that I want to. Sorry. This is just like a movie preview, right? Just as interesting. Okay. So this is kind of a chart about who can be removed, right? This is actually the people who can't be removed. This is lawful permanent residents. This is employment and people with protected status. These are tourist students and applicants, and these are the other groups. Well, why do I have this up here? Under the law, right, the idea here is it depends on whether or not you actually got permission to come into the United States in the first place. If you had permission to come into the United States in the first place, a whole different set of rules apply to you. So, for example, if I came in even on a tourist visa or a student visa, and I came into the United States with a student visa, a completely different set of laws applied to whether or not I can be removed. On the other hand, if I crossed the border without talking to anyone and made the precarious journey over the Rio Grande and then ended up in the United States, well, a completely different set of rules applied to me. And it's really important to see this distinction because a lot of things get confused about what we think happens in the deportation process. For instance, the group of people that have already been admitted into the United States, meaning that this group of people, the people who were allowed in the United States, apprehension by law enforcement usually would require a little bit more than that in order to get them removed. But for the people who came in without any kind of inspection or admission, that group of people, the law enforcement system is not used as what I would say as the basis for removal, but simply as the basis for detection. Okay? So, let me just give an example. If I'm in the United States and I am a lawful permanent resident, and I get picked up for, let's say, a DUI, all right, and I go through the criminal justice system, will ICE pick me up? Probably not if that's my only criminal contact. Will ICE pick me up if I get convicted for DUI? Probably not if that's my only criminal contact, because DUIs on their own is not a basis for removal. Okay? However, and this is sort of screwed up, but marijuana in a motor vehicle, which is a petty misdemeanor charge, right? It can be ticketed. There's some good case law on this now, but if, for instance, I got picked up, I got arrested, and I had some marijuana in my car, and they initially charged me with fifth-degree possession, but of course, Mary's fine lawyers were working with me, and we were able to negotiate a deal where they basically dropped it down to a petty, right? Well, would I get picked up as a lawful permanent resident on the arrest? No. Would I get picked up as during the time prior to sentencing? No. But if I get convicted and sentenced for petty misdemeanor or possession of a marijuana in a motor vehicle, that can lend me into immigration removal proceedings. Why? Because controlled substance violations are a ground of removability. So I'm going to reiterate this point because it's very, very important. All right? The criminal justice system works in two ways when it comes to the deportation system. The first way is just detection. If you enter the criminal justice system, you are likely going to come into contact with ICE, or at least ICE knows about you. Whether or not they decide to detain you is going to be dependent on the second part. The criminal justice system can also decide whether or not you have gotten a conviction which could lead to deportation. So what does this mean? What is the implication here? The implication here is what you cannot say just to everyone who's not a citizen how you can get detected or what's going to happen unless you know a bit more about that person's immigration status. Because the biggest implication here is I could be someone without any, if I never got admitted into the United States, no matter what happens in the criminal justice system, a dismissal, they picked me up and then released me, they decided I was innocent, all of that doesn't matter because all that happened was now they know about me, and if ICE knows about me, they might also know that I am not here on any form of admission, and that's when I can get picked up. Okay? So why does this matter? Well, it matters because when the new enforcement system came into place, much of the time they had this idea, right, that not everyone who's undocumented were a priority for being put into the immigration system. Now, as a lawyer working during that period of time, it's not like it was a golden age, folks, right? We argued all the time that their priorities were screwed up and who they considered to be dangerous was wrong and who they considered to be criminals was sort of screwed up. But at least then, there was some idea that if someone, for instance, was a student visa holder, right, who had just graduated, was married to a lawful permanent resident, and had a child who was under 6 months old, and did not actually have a conviction for anything, that they wouldn't be a priority to be put in the removal system. That is what's changed. Is that everybody, whether or not they have a criminal history, or whether or not they can be considered at large to be dangerous or risk of flight, if they came here without any sort of inspection or admission, they have become a priority for removal. It has been a big sea change as an immigration attorney looking at clients. Now, that said, many people who are here undocumented and who never were admitted into the United States, they still escape detection, right? If they never get arrested by the law enforcement, the chances of being detected are lower. But we see things like traffic stops. We see things like now, of course, I'm sure you guys know about the raid that happened downstate. You see things like ICE looking people up in student databases and going to their houses and arresting people directly. You see things like where previously people, let's say, right, if I'm undocumented because I'm overstayed my visa. I overstayed my visa by a year. But I also found love, right? Lucky me, that's much better than a student visa. And my wife happens to be a U.S. citizen. Well, as an immigration attorney, we would say, hey, you can use that relationship and get a green card. And if you do that, then you don't have to worry about being deported. So what's changed? What's changed is when that person applies to get a green card, many people who go to that interview, even though what they're doing is perfectly legal, the fact that they had overstayed their visa originally doesn't prevent them from getting a green card, but can land them in removal proceedings. So what ends up happening is people will get referred to removal proceedings, and instead of what's called USCIS adjudicating whether or not they would get a visa, it's forced to go to an immigration judge. The biggest difference is people are getting detained in the meantime, right? So that they either have to post a bond or they have to go through their case while they are in detention. All right. So some other relevant points of information, and really I'm not going through this because it's too long, for one thing, right? And the second, it's more for just to give an overview of what we're talking about. So let's say I am caught by immigration either by arrest, ICE comes pick me up from Hennepin County Jail, or ICE comes pick me up after being released, or ICE comes picks me up at my home, or ICE comes picks me up after a traffic stop, right? What happens is then I get processed. I get fingerprinted and I get a question. This is something that I think is very much underappreciated. The last 5 years or so, the amount of information that the U.S. government is collecting on not just non-citizens, but on everyone is staggering. Because what they are doing is one of the complaints, right, about September 11th was the fact that you had separate databases that were not necessarily able to share this information. One of the things that changed, FBI started to take on not only criminal information, right, like warrants for arrests, but now started taking on immigration information. And then DHS upped it again in what's called an IDENT database. So the databases that are being now used to track both citizens and non-citizens alike have grown exponentially. It's huge, and we still don't quite know exactly the scope of this. But this is how a lot of people are getting caught as well. Because, and I think there was a question about, well, what happens when someone gets booked? Doesn't the fact that Hennepin might, does the fact that there's all people who go in through Hennepin County Jail, does that mean that someone from Hennepin County Jail called ICE? And the answer is no. Because what happens is, once the fingerprints are taken, those fingerprints are sent, there's a fingerprint match that goes to a DHS database. If that fingerprint matches something, that information that they already had, let's say they were deported 5 years ago, or they even applied for a visa, they are in normal status, that gets a match and it goes to ICE. Then ICE goes ahead and sends what's called an informational detainer and says, hey, we think this person might be removable. We are letting you know this. Okay? Now it's true that someone from the jail could be the source by calling ICE, primarily because, obviously, not everyone's fingerprints are in this giant database. It's getting bigger and bigger, but it's not comprehensive, right? So there is a possibility that someone is picking up the phone and calling people at ICE. That absolutely is happening. We know that. But it's not happening in every single instance. Okay. So it takes about a day to get processed, and then you get all this paperwork. And this paperwork is basically saying things like, it's an interview. They have a database, but they're also interviewing these people. They don't get a lawyer. They basically are not told about Miranda. They're not told they can stay silent, and they just get interviewed, and the person starts giving information. That ends up in these documentation. Then there's a custody review, and there's a recent controversy, right? Just like with a lot of systems, computer algorithms are starting to play a bigger and bigger role about whether or not to detain someone. Well, ICE has been using what's called a risk assessment system for a number of years now. But a former colleague of mine wrote a paper because she had analyzed a lot of this data and found that because this risk assessment system uses priority memos from the Trump administration to determine that risk classification, there was a recent memo by Trump that essentially said anyone who is charged, might be charged, or might be guilty of a potential crime is a priority for detention. Well, it was so broad that then the computer just started spitting out everyone should be detained. Right? That doesn't mean everyone gets detained, because there's a process to ask for bond, there's a process to get in front of an immigration judge and decide it. But it does mean that a large number of people, and these are the facilities, actually Nobles County and Candy Ojai County should be added to this list. They are definitely growing in size of detention centers here. But I put here that it took 10 days from processing to get to immigration court. That's not true. It is now at least 3 weeks, and more often 4 to 5 weeks, between the time that I get put into immigration custody until the time I see an immigration judge. What's confusing is there are some folks that are seeing immigration judges a little bit earlier, and it kind of depends on which judge you end up getting. But generally, it's not unusual. I just saw a bunch of people at Sherburne County yesterday, and most of them had told me that they had been there for at least 2 to 3 weeks, and they didn't have a court schedule. So it's not unusual for 3 weeks or 4 weeks before you go from being detained to being scheduled to go to your first day in court. Obviously, what does that mean? That means a lot of people are tired of being detained. And even if they could fight their case, or even if they could fight a way to get their bond, many people at that point start to lose hope and are not involved, right? I'm involved with another organization called the Minnesota Freedom Fund that works to pay bail both on the criminal side and on the immigration side. And there's some fascinating data about how quickly your time in detention, I think something like as short as 48 hours, where if you are in detention for more than 48 hours, the number of negative consequences that happen to you in your life are huge. And it's not that surprising, right? Can you imagine having to call into work? Can you imagine what childcare would look like? Can you imagine all sorts of different things if you were detained? And so on the immigration side, 3 to 4 weeks is not unusual before you even get a shot at talking to the judge. These are the different kinds of hearings. I don't think that's of interest to you guys. This is a whole process afterwards. Basically, the entire process of deportation, depending on whether or not you get in front of a judge or not. But if you get in front of a judge, you could be deported within a week of that first time you're in court, or within 2 years. What do you think is the basis? What's the difference between finishing a case in 1 week and finishing a case in 2 years?
Whether it's appealed or not?
Not just whether appealed, it's whether you're trying to fight your case at all or not. Right? The numbers are, if you try to fight your case at all, you go from an average time of 30 with a median of 1 day, right? An average time of 30 days in detention to 90-something days in detention just by filing an application saying you want to stay in the United States. If you end up appealing, that number jumps to more than 190 days in detention. In Minnesota, we're actually not that bad compared to the rest of the country. But it is not. I definitely have clients that have been in detention and waiting for more than a year. I had one not too long ago that was released after 2 years in custody. But in Arizona, people can be detained for close to 3 to 4 years on their case because of the kind of drag that's happening. And of course, the idea here is if you're being detained longer because you want to fight your case, well, that's an old story, right? That means you're not going to want to fight your case. There are lots of people that I've talked to who would have a chance to win their case, but they cannot be detained any longer, either out of fear or precisely because they're worried about their families and they cannot find a way to support them. Okay. So this is the law of removal. As I said, the biggest issue here is if you are not admitted, there's all different sort of rules. If you are admitted, there's these different rules. Okay. Yes.
If you were detained and you don't have a lawyer, can you represent yourself?
Yes. The chances of winning when you're unrepresented versus the chances of winning when you're represented, the numbers are pretty bad, right? I think you're 37 times more likely to win your case if you have a lawyer, right? The number is a little bit skewed, I will say though, because there is not a public defender system. What it means is a lot of people who get represented, there is a sorting problem because lawyers are only going to take cases that they think they can win, right? So you have an issue where a lot of people who are unrepresented really don't have cases to go forward, so they don't win. Right? Even if they had a lawyer, the issue is they might have lost anyway. And this is something I do think that's underappreciated. We talk about the need for a fair process, which I absolutely agree with. Immigration, has anyone seen the John Oliver thing when he had the tot court with little children in immigration court? If you haven't, it's hilarious, but it's true, right? Immigration court, if you're a minor, you're still going in and you're not guaranteed a lawyer. So there are kids in immigration proceedings who are 3 years old or even younger, and they don't have a lawyer representing them. And it's this sort of like, what an unfair process, right? It's true. You don't get a lawyer. It can be an unfair process. You don't get the burden of proof issue. You don't get a lot of different things. You don't have a right to a jury trial. But I want to emphasize, it's not just process. The law itself is really harsh. You could have the fairest process in the world, but if the law is really, really hard on people trying to stay in the United States, it doesn't matter. And I don't think that's appreciated enough because for a person in the United States, we can talk about, I hear a lot of times, I'll talk to someone who's been in the United States, let's say 6 years. They have 2 United States children. They come in undocumented. They have no history of any criminal activity whatsoever. And they are married to a U.S. citizen. And they are beloved by the community. And the question is, well, can't they stay in the United States if they go through removal proceedings? And the answer is no. You need 10 years of uninterrupted presence in the United States for even to be able to apply for something. And then you have to have a relative, and I mean not brother, sister, cousin, uncle, grandparents, no matter how much you are close to them, but it must be a spouse or child. And then you must be able to show that that spouse or child, not you, that spouse or child would suffer what's called unusual hardship. Not, and they specifically say this, not the hardship usually attendant to being removed, right? Like it's this idea that they recognize, hey, deportation really sucks, but you're going to have to go beyond what normally sucks about deportation. So my point is, there's a whole lot of people who are, no matter what, who we, I think, as a society, many of us would think should have a shot at being able to stay, but they don't. And it doesn't matter how many people in the community can kind of rally, the law is really harsh. Okay. Any other questions about that? Okay. So there's this issue. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of this. Yeah, so this is like the relief from removal that I talked about. There are 2 ways, by the way, and I think this is where it's also really confusing, because just as there are those examples of people who are really paragons of the community and who we would think, would be great examples of being able to stay in the United States, there are, I think, some instances where people are allowed to stay and people are scratching their head, why, right? Some of these people, some non-citizens can go through the removal process and can have very, very serious felonies, and the U.S. government does not deport them. There are two main ways that can happen, and I think it's illustrative. One, it's that they are from a country that there is nowhere really to deport them to, right? So there are people who are literally stateless, like no country will recognize them, but there are also countries that we don't have a great diplomatic relationship and they're not taking people back. This administration, that's one of the big changes, is this administration is working really hard and pressuring a lot of countries to take people back. In one area that I've been doing quite a bit of work on, for instance, Cambodia, right? These are people, and I've had clients, who never lived in Cambodia, right? Their parents fled Cambodia during the killing fields. This is literally, and if you know anything about the killing fields period of time, it's the Pol Pot stuff is just horrific. But these families fled. They then lived for a number of years in a Thai refugee camp. During that time in the Thai refugee camp, they had children. They come to the United States, their children can get deported back to Cambodia. For a long period of time, they were not being deported back to Cambodia because Cambodia was not taking them back or doing very little to work towards taking them back. That changed because what changed? The U.S. government started pressuring Cambodia and said, if you don't start taking people back, we're not going to do trade with you, we're going to prevent you from getting visas, and then Cambodia started taking more people back. But these are literally people who've never been to Cambodia, were never born there, have no connection, and they end up deported to a country they never knew about, right? So there are people who, and right now, Hmong is one group, and Somalia is really weird. It goes back and forth. There were a period of time where we were not deporting people to Somalia because there was no government there. Then we were trying to, even when there was no government there. Then we were able to, and then stopped, and then start, and then stop again. And now we are doing it again. Okay? But you might encounter people who are Somalis, and there has been a confusing, the last 10 years itself has gone back and forth about whether or not we are deporting Somalis. One other group that's a common one that does not get deported is Cubans. There is a small group of Cubans that do get deported, but it's still pretty small, and we'll see what that happens. But there is a lot of pressure, for instance, on Laos to take back people, including potentially Hmong, which I think is really, like, just from a historical perspective, really problematic. But that is likely what happens. So that's one group. But they can be deported. They can go through that deportation system. The immigration judge could say, you're deported, but ICE can't physically put them on a plane, so they're still here. Another group, of course, is because no matter how badly you've had a life here, no matter how poorly you've been able to adjust, and no matter what kind of criminal history here, we have an obligation not to send people back if they're going to be tortured or killed, right? Now this gets tricky because we do send people back if they just say they're going to be killed. They have to be tortured for us to not send them back, right? So this is the whole thing about Honduras, right? One of the most dangerous countries in the world, and the whole thing about, by the way, the domestic violence stuff, which did change. Hey, yeah, you could be killed, but if you're not killed for a specific reason, such as inflicting torture, or you're not killed because of what's called a particular social group, international law and domestic law does not protect you against being sent back. If you're only going to be killed because someone has it out against you, or if you're only going to be killed under Jeff Sessions' view because you have a partner that's been going after you, right? Then that's not our problem. And so that's one thing that has changed, is that idea, right? But it's been in the law for a while that, torture or persecution could protect you in certain circumstances. But it is confusing sometimes, I think, for people to say, wait a minute, you tell me that even the best of the community members can be deported, but I know some people who are here with really severe crimes who are not. And there's a little bit of a confusion of that. But that's usually because either the country themselves are not taking them back, or there's reason to think that that person would actually suffer persecution or harm.
you've gone through the process and they've chosen that you should be deported back to your country, but it's a country that isn't taking people back right now. And then in the future it does, or now it does, and it did before, are they deporting those people?
Oh,
back, or-
absolutely.
Okay.
That was a huge controversy this last year. Iraqis. There's a whole bunch of Iraqis who came in and were deported for the last few years, and then they weren't deporting Iraqis back, right? And it's really important to remember, right? The timing matters, right? So they weren't being deported. They had old removal orders. Suddenly they were being called in and say, we're going to deport you. And a lot of the Iraqis were, wait a minute, it's really dangerous now, right? ISIS was depending on which month you're in now. Like now it's not ISIS, but it can be other groups that can be dangerous. Or, right, someone says, when I was originally deported, okay, I didn't really have a claim to fear, but now that I've been living in the United States, I got married, I'm now a Christian, and I'm really afraid, right? So they are deporting those people, and those people are very vulnerable because they need to try to affirmatively way to protect themselves, which is what's called motions to reopen, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not necessarily easy. But yes, they definitely have people putting on planes. Most of the Cambodians that they're deporting now were actually ordered deported years and years ago. I had someone who was ordered deported more than 25 years ago who didn't get deported until this last year. And you can think about what that means, because what that means is that person built a life, a family, children, they good job. This person did, by the way, and I did everything that we would have expected someone to do or hoped that they would do in terms of reformation of their life, right? It didn't matter under immigration. He still got deported. Okay. All right. I think it's a good time to talk about, I think I've only got 10 minutes, but we can talk about other questions. If we don't, then I'll talk a little bit about public charge. Is that something that people want to hear about a little bit? Okay. Any questions from what I talked about? Anything? Yes.
You said the law is really harsh. Is there a name for that law, or a statute number that you're?
Sure. It's the Immigration and Nationality Statute. Oh, I was going to write it, but it's called the INA, or it's the federal statute Title 8. And you want to look specifically, if you are interested in just have a lot of need to find a way to get to sleep, 212, 237, and 240 of the Immigration and Nationality Act will give you an idea of the harshness of these laws. But as I said, because this is administrative law, the actual harshness usually comes in the form of discretion issued by the government. And that's where you'll see that it's very difficult to complain because there isn't a specific law that confines discretion in a lot of these situations.
It feels real capricious.
Yeah, and I think there is, I would say that a lot of my colleagues and I would say that it's deliberately capricious because it creates fear. Many people who I would say would not have been worried are very worried about what's going on. So and that's a good segue to the public charge stuff, right? So the grounds of deportation and inadmissibility for being a public charge has been in the books of the United States laws almost from the beginning of immigration laws itself, which is probably about the early 1900s. Right? And so the term public charge has been there for a while. The idea is public charge is if you are going to come in the United States and literally think that you're going to be a leech, right? You're not allowed to come to the United States. It's not surprising that this has been a position of the U.S. government for a long time. The problem, of course, is that was very quickly not used. I've almost never seen someone being deported based only on a public charge thing. prior to what is being proposed. And so there was an interpretation that happened in the 1990s that kind of laid this out a little bit, which basically said a lot of like income maintenance programs, specifically food stamp programs, were not going to be used in the calculation of whether someone's a public charge, which is good, right? I mean, I think that's generally a good thing, because whatever you're feeling about it, I think a lot of people would say many of those programs, people usually only need it for a short period of time, and then they're usually doing quite well. What is the new change? The new change is two huge effects, which is one, things like food stamps can now be considered a basis to consider public charge. Things like the child, and this is really pernicious, if you have a citizen child and you are enrolling that citizen child in something like a child health program or food stamps through the child, you would still be considered a public charge even if the benefits are for your family, your U.S. citizen family. And so that's the proposed change in the regulation. There were two memos on that was leaked, one in March and then later again, I think one in August. The difference between the one in March and the one in August, the one in March primarily dealt with people who might be deported, meaning if you are here and you have public charge, you might face deportation, or you might not be able to get a visa and stay in the United States. The one in August, and the one that NBC kind of published or talked about, was affecting people who might want to naturalize. Meaning if you were a lawful permanent resident and you got one of these benefit programs and you want to naturalize, you might be denied naturalization. And I have had several, not just friends and former clients, go, wait a minute, I've been on this program or I've gotten this. Do I need to worry about this for naturalization? And my response is, well, it's a proposed rule. So I think the idea is get going now, right? Try to figure out a way, if you're eligible for naturalization, do it now before this rule is put into place. But it's uncertain, right? I mean, the problem here is, as you say, it's capricious. They can leak something like this, and then the whole community doesn't know how to react, right? It's very, very scary. And then next thing we know, a whole lot less people are actually applying for these programs, and a whole lot less people are applying for naturalization and applying for green cards without even actually having the rule go forward. So who knows? I mean, I won't say that this is evil machinations, but it doesn't have to be. It still can have the same effect. Any other questions? Yes.
I know in the past there used to be a lot of self-deportation. Is that still something that's...
Yes, I think that's, we've had a period of time where we've had net zero migration, meaning that there were, even for every undocumented person that was coming into the United States, there was at least as many leaving, right? So our undocumented population has been relatively stable and not growing, despite some of the kind of imagery and rhetoric. So do self-deportation happen? Absolutely. Some of it is very natural, by the way. I'm not saying all self-deportations are unnatural. Remember, prior to the 1990, to the change in the law in 1996, migration to and from the United States from Mexico was cyclical. And it was, people would come, work, go back. People would do that on a regular basis. And that still happens, but the laws that put in place really discourage that. And that's one of the reasons why that undocumented population grew, was because we started punishing people not for coming, though we did do that, but also for leaving. So then it became a situation where you had the population grow in a certain way. I think my time is up. I apologize if I didn't get any questions. Were there any questions from there? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. And there's a very